Have you ever wondered what true authority looks like? Is it the sharp suit in the corner office? The booming voice that commands a room? Or is it something quieter, something forged in fire and tempered by discipline, something so deeply ingrained that it needs no announcement? We are often fooled by the uniform, by the title, by the superficial markers of power we've been taught to recognize. We see the janitor, not the man who holds the keys to every door. We see the ground crew, not the woman who holds the fate of every flight in the palm of her hand. This is a story about a man who made that mistake. A man who looked but did not see. And in doing so, he learned a lesson not just about power, but about the profound, unshakable dignity of the human spirit. It began on a sun-scorched tarmac, a place of noise and hurry, where steel birds rested before clawing their way back into the sky. It was a place of function over form, a sprawling concrete expanse where military precision and commercial urgency collided daily. Here, at Northwood Joint Air Base, Air Force fighters shared airspace with civilian airliners, a delicate dance of protocol and profit. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the air shimmered with heat, and the whine of a nearby C-17 warming its engines was a constant gut-rumbling presence. Amidst this controlled chaos, a woman moved with a quiet purpose that seemed to bend the noise around her. She wore simple, unadorned navy blue coveralls, the kind that could belong to a mechanic, a fueler, or a baggage handler. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, disciplined bun, and her hands, though ungloved, were methodical and sure. She was inspecting the landing gear of a gleaming Boeing 777, its fuselage emblazoned with the logo of a premier international airline, Global Voyager. Her touch was not just a check, it was a conversation. Her fingers traced the lines of the hydraulic actuators. Her eyes scanned the tire pressure indicators. Her entire being focused on the intricate mechanics of this magnificent machine. She moved from the port side gear to the nose gear, her brow furrowed in concentration. To the casual observer, she was just another part of the complex human machinery that kept the airport running, as anonymous as the fuel truck or the luggage conveyor. She was invisible, a ghost in the machine, and that was precisely how she preferred it. This focus, this deep dive into the tangible reality of steel and rubber, was her sanctuary. It was where the crushing weight of her responsibilities could be, for a moment, translated into the simple, honest language of physics and engineering. Every bolt had a torque specification. Every hydraulic line had a pressure rating. These were truths, solid and reliable, in a world that was often anything but. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't immediately notice the approaching figures, their silhouettes wavering in the heat haze. They walked with the easy, confident stride of men who owned the spaces they occupied. The figure in the lead was Captain Jack Harrington. He was the kind of man who seemed to have been born with a perfect smile and a golden tan. His pilot's uniform was immaculately tailored, the gold epaulets on his shoulders gleaming in the harsh sun. A ridiculously expensive Swiss watch peeked from beneath his cuff. He was at the top of his game, a senior captain for a major airline, and he carried that knowledge not as a responsibility, but as a privilege. He was followed by his first officer, a younger man named David, who seemed to be in a perpetual state of trying to keep up with Jack's swagger. As they approached the 777, their aircraft, Jack's eyes swept over the scene. He was running late. A weather system over the Atlantic had delayed their inbound flight, and now the turnaround was tight. Every minute on the ground cost the airline thousands of dollars, a fact that was constantly drilled into the heads of senior pilots like him. His gaze fell upon the woman inspecting his nose gear. He saw the plain coveralls. He saw her dark skin. he saw a woman doing a man's job in his mind, and in the crucible of his stress, his arrogance, and his ingrained prejudice, he made a calculation. He saw a low-level ground crew worker, someone to be hurried along, or, even better, someone to use as a release valve for his mounting frustration. He turned to David, a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't look around to see who might be listening. He wanted an audience. His crew, the ground staff, anyone within earshot. He wanted them to share in his casual, cruel assessment. He wanted to perform. "See that?" he said, jutting his chin toward the woman, his voice carrying easily over the engine whine. "That's what happens when you let the diversity hires check the planes, probably ticking boxes on a coloring book." The joke landed with a thud. David, the first officer, gave a weak, uncomfortable laugh, his eyes darting nervously toward the woman. A pair of flight attendants who were trailing behind them stopped dead, their smiles freezing on their faces. A nearby baggage handler, a young man in an orange vest, flinched as if struck. The military airman operating a nearby service vehicle, who had been watching the airliner with professional curiosity, suddenly went rigid. Their movement ceased. Their gazes became hard, fixed, and utterly unreadable. They all heard it. They all looked at the woman. They all waited. He said it loud enough for the whole crew to hear. That was the mistake. It wasn't just the words, cruel and dismissive as they were. It was the volume, the performance, the public declaration of his contempt. He had drawn a circle and placed her outside of it, marking her as lesser, as an object of ridicule in her own workspace. The woman did not flinch. She did not gasp. For a full 3 seconds she remained perfectly still, her hand resting on the massive tire of the nose gear. It was as if she were drawing strength from the solid, unyielding reality of the machine. The world seemed to hold its breath. The distant engine whine, the clatter of machinery, the very air itself seemed to pause, waiting for her reaction. Then, slowly, deliberately, she straightened up. She was taller than Jack had assumed, her posture ramrod straight, imbued with a discipline that seemed to come from her very bones. She turned, not with the hurried motion of someone startled, but with the measured, almost regal slowness of someone in complete and utter control. She wiped her hands on a clean rag she pulled from her pocket, a simple, methodical gesture that was somehow filled with immense weight. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and held a depth that seemed to draw in all the light and noise around them. There was no anger in them, not yet. There was something far more unnerving, a profound, crystalline disappointment. It was the look of a master craftsman discovering a fatal flaw in a piece of work. For the first time, a flicker of doubt entered Jack Harrington's mind. This was not the reaction he expected. He expected a flustered retort, a nervous glance away, or maybe an angry but powerless outburst. He did not expect this unnerving, absolute calm. He felt a sudden, prickling need to reassert his dominance, to double down on his position. "Is there a problem with my aircraft?" he asked, his tone sharp and impatient. "We're on a tight schedule." The woman's gaze did not waver. It swept past him, taking in his nervous first officer, the mortified flight attendants, and the stone-faced military personnel who were still watching, motionless. She saw the entire tableau, the ripple effect of his casual cruelty. Her eyes returned to his. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud. It was quiet, clear, and carried the unmistakable timbre of command. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "There is now," she said simply. Jack's bravado surged back, fueled by indignation. Who was this woman to hold him up? "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm the captain of this flight, and I'm telling you, we are cleared for departure." So if you're done with your inspection, we need to get moving." He took a step forward, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate her. It was like trying to intimidate a mountain. The woman took a small, almost imperceptible breath. "This aircraft is grounded," she stated. It was not a suggestion. It was not a debate. It was a fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. The words hung in the hot, vibrating air, grounded. The word was a death sentence on a tarmac. It meant chaos, cancellations, inquiries, and a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. Jack Harrington stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity. A ground crew worker, a mechanic, grounding his multi-million-dollar aircraft? It was absurd. Laughter, sharp and incredulous, burst from his lips. "You're what? You're grounding my plane? You can't do that. You have no authority." He gestured expansively, his arrogance returning in a tidal wave. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Captain Jack Harrington. I have 1,000,000 miles in the air. I'm responsible for 300 souls on this plane. You are a line checker." He spat the last words out, his face reddening with fury. The woman's expression remained unchanged, a mask of implacable calm. The disappointment in her eyes was now being replaced by something else, something colder and harder. It was the look of a leader about to enforce a necessary but unpleasant consequence. "I know exactly who you are, Captain Harrington," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with steel. "You're a pilot with a commendable flight record and, until a few moments ago, an impeccable service history. You are also a guest on my base." She paused, letting the last 3 words sink in. "My base." The possessive pronoun was a shot across his bow, but he was too enraged to understand its significance. "Your base?" he scoffed. "This is a civilian airport." "It is Northwood Joint Air Base," she corrected him, her tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. "It is a United States Air Force installation that permits civilian operations under strict protocols. Protocols which you have just violated." A cold dread, colder than any high-altitude air, began to seep into Jack's bones. He looked past her, at the military airmen who were no longer just watching. They were now, slowly, deliberately, beginning to move. One was speaking quietly into a radio. Another was walking toward a set of chalks. They were acting on an unspoken order. His order. Who are you?" he finally stammered, the question stripped of its earlier arrogance, now laced with genuine, dawning fear. The woman stood a little straighter, if that were even possible. The anonymity of the simple coverall seemed to melt away, replaced by the invisible mantle of her rank. "I am Colonel Eva Rostova," she said, her voice ringing with the authority she had, until now, kept sheathed. "And I am the commander of this base." The world tilted on its axis for Jack Harrington. Colonel, base commander. The words detonated in the space between them, vaporizing his ego, his arrogance, his entire sense of reality. He looked at her again, and this time he finally saw. He saw the discipline in her posture, the command in her eyes, the lifetime of service etched into the lines on her face. He saw the woman who held absolute authority over every inch of this concrete, every machine and every person on it. The blood drained from his face, leaving his golden tan a pasty, sickly gray. He saw his career, his reputation, his entire life, flashing before his eyes. Colonel Rostova's gaze was unpitying. "Your careless and unprofessional conduct presents a clear and present danger to the discipline and safety I demand on this installation. Your comments were not just an insult to me, but to every single person on this tarmac who performs their duties with the professionalism you so clearly lack." She raised her hand slightly, and one of the military airmen immediately jogged over, holding a tablet. She took it, her fingers tapping a few commands on the screen with practiced efficiency. "Your flight privileges at Northwood are hereby suspended, pending a full conduct and safety review by my office and the FAA, to whom I will be sending a formal report within the hour," she declared. "Your airline will be notified. This aircraft will not be going anywhere until a new command crew is vetted and approved by me. You are to surrender your base credentials and be escorted to the civilian terminal. Is that understood, Captain?" Jack Harrington could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. The man who had entered the tarmac like a king was now a prisoner, his kingdom shrinking to the space of his own 2 feet. Colonel Rostova handed the tablet back to the airman. She gave Jack one last lingering look. "You saw a woman in coveralls," she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. Yet it cut him deeper than any shout. "You should have seen an officer. You should have seen a professional. But most of all, Captain, you should have just seen a person. Your failure to do so is the reason you are no longer in command of anything." With that, she turned her back on him and walked away, her quiet, purposeful stride once again seeming to bend the world around her, leaving Jack Harrington alone in the deafening silence of his own colossal mistake. The news hit the Global Voyager Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago like a sonic boom. The frantic call from the Northwood operations manager had sent shockwaves up the chain of command, culminating in a terse, explosive briefing in the office of the CEO, Arthur Thompson. Thompson was a man who lived by the numbers. He saw the world in terms of profit margins, stock prices, and logistical efficiency. He was in his late 50s with a mane of silver hair and a disposition that was usually as cool and polished as the marble floors in his lobby. But now, his face was a thundercloud. "Grounded," he roared, slamming his hand down on his expansive mahogany desk. "Our flagship 777 to London is grounded by some power-tripping base commander over a joke? A stupid joke?" His chief operating officer, a harried-looking man named Bill, winced. "It's a bit more complicated, Arthur. It's a joint military-civilian base. The commander, a Colonel Rostova, has broad authority." "I don't care if she's the Queen of England," Thompson shot back, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the city. "This is costing us $250,000 an hour. Get our legal team on the phone. Find out who this Colonel Superior is. We go over her head. We'll have her running a supply depot in Antarctica by the time we're done with her." What was the pilot's name again? "Harrington, Jack Harrington, one of our best," Bill supplied. "He claims the colonel overreacted to a harmless comment." "Of course she overreacted," Thompson snapped. "This is what happens when you give people a little bit of power. They can't wait to use it." He saw the situation in the starkest possible terms. A military bureaucrat drunk on her own authority, needlessly disrupting his finely tuned commercial operation. He saw an asset, his pilot, being unfairly targeted. He saw his company's reputation being tarnished and its bottom line bleeding. He did not, for a moment, consider the content of the joke or the context in which it was delivered. To him, it was just a comment, a triviality blown out of proportion. His mind was already formulating a multi-pronged attack: legal threats, political pressure through their lobbyists in Washington, and a full-throated media campaign painting the airline as a victim of military red tape. He would crush this Colonel Rostova. He would make an example of her. He told his team to get to work, his voice sharp with the certainty of a man who was used to getting his way. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that money and influence were the ultimate forms of power. capable of bulldozing any obstacle. He had no idea that he was about to run into a form of power that couldn't be bought, intimidated, or negotiated with. He was about to come up against a principle. Meanwhile, back at Northwood, Colonel Eva Rostova sat in her office. It was a stark contrast to Arthur Thompson's luxurious suite. The room was functional, Spartan, and impeccably organized. The furniture was standard-issue military steel and wood. The only personal touches were a small, vibrant orchid on her windowsill and a single framed photograph on her desk. It was an old black-and-white photo of a young man in the uniform of a Tuskegee airman, his smile proud and confident, standing in front of a P-51 Mustang. It was her grandfather. She was typing her report, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same steady precision she had shown on the tarmac. Her words were clear, concise, and devoid of emotion. She detailed the time, the location, the personnel present. She transcribed Captain Harrington's comment verbatim. But the bulk of her report was not about the insult. It was about the doctrine of command presence. She wrote, Captain Harrington's public and derogatory remarks about a member of the ground support team, regardless of that individual's identity, demonstrate a critical failure of leadership. A captain's authority is not an inherent right of their rank. It is a bond of trust forged with their crew, the support staff, and the passengers who place their lives in their hands. By publicly demeaning an individual he perceived as subordinate, he eroded that bond. His action suggests a mindset where perceived status dictates the level of respect and attention afforded to an individual. This is an unacceptable trait in anyone responsible for the complex and collaborative process of flight operations. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Her mind went back to the tarmac, to the look on Harrington's face. It wasn't just arrogance she had seen. It was a blindness, a willful refusal to see beyond his own narrow, preconceived notions. He hadn't seen a professional performing a critical safety check. He had seen a category, a stereotype. And that, to her, was the most dangerous thing of all. A pilot who couldn't see the person in front of him might also fail to see the ice on the wing, the warning light on the panel, the fatigue in his co-pilot's eyes. Her grandfather's face smiled out at her from the frame. She remembered his stories. Stories of fighting two wars, one against the enemies of his country, and another against the prejudice of his countrymen. He had faced insults far worse than the one she had endured today, yet he had never compromised his standards. Dignity, Ava, he used to tell her, isn't something they give you. It's something you carry. You carry it in the shine on your boots, in the crease in your trousers, and in the way you treat the man who sweeps the floor. Because a lack of attention to the small things reveals a soul unprepared for the big things. That was the core of her belief system, the foundation of her command. It wasn't about the personal sting of the insult. It was about the sanctity of the standard. Jack Harrington hadn't just insulted her. He had insulted the very principle of professional respect that made air travel possible. He had introduced a poison into the system, and it was her duty to purge it. She finished her report, attached the witness statements from her airmen, and digitally signed it with a crisp, decisive click. She addressed it to the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Safety and Compliance, and copied Arthur Thompson, CEO of Global Voyager Airlines. She wasn't hiding. She was inviting the scrutiny. She was confident that her decision, like the landing gear of the plane she had inspected, would hold up under pressure. Her power wasn't in her title. It was in the unshakable certainty that she was right. 2 days later, Arthur Thompson found himself on a corporate jet, flying toward Northwood Air Base. His initial strategy of overwhelming force had hit a brick wall. His lawyers had been met with polite but firm bureaucratic refusal. His lobbyists had been told, in no uncertain terms, that interfering with a base commander's authority on a safety matter was a non-starter. The FAA had already opened a formal investigation based on Colonel Rostova's report. He was losing. The grounded 777 was a bleeding wound on his balance sheet, and the story was beginning to leak to the press, framed not as military overreach, but as a pilot's misconduct. Frustrated and cornered, he had decided on a new tactic: a personal visit. He would go there himself, meet this colonel, and use his considerable personal charm and the weight of his position to resolve the situation. He still believed it was a misunderstanding, a clash of egos that could be smoothed over. He envisioned a stern but ultimately reasonable military officer who, once she understood the financial and logistical implications, would relent. He was escorted from the civilian side of the airport to the military command building. The contrast was stark. The commercial terminal was a place of cushioned seats and carpeted floors. The military building was all polished linoleum, right angles, and an echoing quiet that spoke of immense, coiled energy. He was led into Colonel Rostova's office. She stood to greet him. She was in her formal blue service uniform now, the silver eagle insignia of a colonel gleaming on her shoulders, a rack of ribbons adorning her chest. She looked even more formidable than she had in the coveralls. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm and even. She gestured to the simple chair opposite her desk. "Thank you for coming. Colonel Rostova," he began, forgoing the handshake and sitting down, his briefcase clutched in his lap like a shield. "I'll be direct. This situation is untenable. Your decision to ground my aircraft and suspend my senior pilot is an extreme overreaction to a poorly chosen comment. I'm here to find a way to end this, get my plane back in the air, and my pilot reinstated." Colonel Rostova listened patiently, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. She let the silence stretch for a moment after he finished, a tactic that immediately put him on the defensive. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "your aircraft is not my aircraft. It is a complex machine entrusted to your company. Your pilot is not my pilot. He is a professional entrusted with the lives of hundreds of people. My decision was not an overreaction. It was a necessary response to a critical failure in professional conduct." Thompson bristled. A failure for telling a joke? It was locker room humor, Colonel. Inappropriate, perhaps, but hardly a matter for grounding an international flight. "Let me be direct with you, then," Rostova countered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Your pilot stood on my tarmac, a space where every action is governed by precision and mutual respect, and he publicly mocked a person he believed to be a subordinate based on her gender and race. He did it loudly, in front of his crew and mine. He performed his prejudice. That is not locker room humor. That is a public demonstration of a dangerously flawed character." She leaned forward, her voice dropping but gaining intensity. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, if a pilot has such poor judgment and situational awareness on the ground, in broad daylight, what is his judgment like at 35,000 feet in a storm? If he doesn't respect the person checking his tires, does he respect the co-pilot who challenges his decision? Does he respect the air traffic controller who gives him an order he doesn't like? The attitude he displayed was not a joke. It was a symptom of a rot of arrogance and carelessness, and I do not allow rot on my base or in the cockpit of any aircraft that takes off from it." Arthur Thompson was stunned into silence. He was a master of the boardroom, a verbal pugilist who could dismantle arguments with financial data and corporate jargon. But he had no defense against this. Colonel Rostova wasn't talking about money or schedules. She was talking about character, about safety, about a philosophy of responsibility that he had long ago started to neglect in his own relentless pursuit of growth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the ribbons on her chest and wondered what stories of service and sacrifice they told. He saw the photograph on her desk, the proud young airman. He saw a woman who was the living embodiment of a code, a creed that he had dismissed as antiquated and inefficient. "My grandfather," she said softly, as if reading his mind, her gaze drifting to the photograph, "flew 70 missions over Europe. He flew with engines that were patched together with hope and a prayer. He landed on runways that were little more than cratered fields. He and the other men of his squadron faced a level of prejudice that would have broken lesser men. But he told me that they never, ever cut a corner. They never skipped a check. They never disrespected the ground crew who patched those planes, because they knew their lives depended on that man's work." She looked back at Thompson, her eyes filled with a conviction that was absolute. They understood that everyone in the chain, from the man who fueled the plane to the pilot in the cockpit, was part of a sacred trust. Your pilot, with his one careless comment, spat on that trust. He declared that some parts of the chain were less valuable than others, and a chain, Mr. Thompson, is only as strong as its weakest link. The words landed on him with the force of a physical blow. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. It was a business cliché, something he'd heard 1,000 times in management seminars. But hearing it from her, in this context, it felt like a profound and terrible truth. He thought about his own company, the relentless pressure for faster turnarounds, the quiet grumbling from maintenance crews about being rushed, the pilots who were treated like rock stars, their egos stroked and their minor transgressions overlooked. He had fostered a culture that prioritized speed and star power over the slow, unglamorous, collaborative work of safety. Jack Harrington wasn't an anomaly. He was the logical product of the system Thompson himself had built. Colonel Rostova's principled stand wasn't an attack on his airline. It was a diagnosis of its sickness. He felt a profound sense of shame. He, Arthur Thompson, the titan of industry, had been so focused on the gleaming aircraft in the sky that he had forgotten the integrity of the people on the ground who made it all possible. He had come here to win a fight, to assert his power. Instead, he was being given a lesson in leadership. He finally understood. This wasn't about a single joke or a single pilot. It was about everything. The return flight to Chicago was quiet. Arthur Thompson didn't speak to his aides. He just stared out the window at the clouds below, his mind replaying the conversation with Colonel Rostova over and over. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The phrase echoed in his head. He had been so obsessed with the strength of the steel, he'd forgotten the character of the men and women who were entrusted with it. His perspective had been irrevocably altered. He no longer saw Colonel Rostova as an obstacle, but as a standard-bearer. She hadn't been punishing his company. She had been protecting a principle that his company should have been championing all along. When he landed, he didn't go home. He went straight back to the office and called an emergency meeting of the executive board for the following morning. The next day, the atmosphere in the boardroom was tense. The executives expected Thompson to announce a new, more aggressive legal strategy. They were not prepared for what came next. "The suspension of Captain Harrington will stand," he announced, his voice steady and firm. Furthermore, upon the conclusion of the FAA's investigation, his employment with Global Voyager will be terminated. Gasps rippled through the room. Jack Harrington was not just a pilot. He was a symbol, a poster boy for the airline. "Arthur, that's insane," one board member protested. "The union will fight us. The pilots will be up in arms." "Let them," Thompson cut him off. This is no longer about one pilot. This is about the culture of this entire company. We have become a company that values ego over expertise and speed over safety. We have celebrated pilots like Harrington while quietly squeezing the maintenance and ground crews who are the bedrock of our operations. That ends today. He then outlined a radical new plan. He announced the immediate firing of Jack Harrington, citing a breach of the company's code of conduct. But he didn't stop there. He announced the creation of a new mandatory training program for all employees, from the boardroom to the baggage handlers, to be called the Command Presence Initiative. It would focus on crew resource management, professional respect, and fostering a culture where every single employee felt empowered to speak up about safety and procedural concerns without fear of reprisal. He told them he was reaching out to a consulting firm, one recommended by Colonel Rostova's command, that specialized in implementing military-grade safety and teamwork protocols in civilian corporations. He was not just solving a problem, he was rebuilding his company's soul from the ground up. The board was stunned, but Thompson's conviction was absolute. He had seen the truth in Colonel Rostova's Spartan office, and he would not be swayed. A few weeks later, on the tarmac at Northwood, Colonel Rostova was conducting another one of her quiet, personal inspections on a newly arrived Global Voyager flight. A young woman in a crisp pilot's uniform approached her, her expression hesitant but determined. "Colonel Rostova?" she asked. Eva turned. "Yes, Captain." "I'm Captain Jennings," the pilot said, extending a hand. "I'm the new command on this flight. I wanted to thank you." Eva looked at her, puzzled. "Thank me for what, Captain?" "For what you did," Jennings replied, her voice earnest. "The talk at the airline, it's completely different now. The new training, the change in attitude, it's real. People are listening to each other again. Maintenance, flight crew, ground staff, we feel like a team. You reminded our leadership of something they had forgotten. You reminded all of us." Eva simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. She shook the young captain's hand. "Just do your job well, Captain. That's all the thanks I need." As the captain walked back to her aircraft, Eva looked up at the vast blue sky. Her grandfather had taught her that one person, standing firm on a principle, could change the world. She had never truly believed it until now. Her stand had not just grounded a plane, it had launched a movement. So, what does true authority look like? It doesn't look like a cocky pilot's swagger or a CEO's expensive suit. It looks like a woman in coveralls, standing her ground on a sun-baked tarmac. It's the quiet, unshakable integrity that comes from knowing your own worth and respecting the worth of others. It is the courage to enforce a standard, not for personal gain or out of spite, but for the good of everyone. Captain Harrington's mistake wasn't just that he told a cruel joke. His mistake was a failure of vision. He looked at Colonel Eva Rostova and saw a series of labels: woman, black, ground crew. He saw what he expected to see, and in doing so, he missed the truth entirely. He failed to see the professional, the leader, the commander. He failed to see the inheritor of a legacy of discipline and honor, a woman whose quiet presence held more genuine power than he had ever wielded in his life. He saw the uniform, but he missed the person inside it. That was his downfall. The world is full of people wearing metaphorical coveralls. They are the quiet colleagues who have brilliant ideas but are never asked. They are the service workers we ignore, who see the world with a clarity we often lack. They are the hidden gems, the overlooked virtuosos whose true value is masked by our own prejudices and assumptions. The story of Colonel Rostova is a reminder that dignity is not conferred by a title, and authority is not granted by a uniform. They are earned through character. They are demonstrated through action. They reside in the soul. It challenges us to look deeper, to see past the superficial markers we use to categorize and dismiss each other. It asks us to see the individual, to recognize the shared humanity and the potential for greatness that exists in everyone, regardless of their station or their appearance. Because true power isn't about the noise you make, it's about the principles you quietly uphold, even and especially when no one is watching. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that true worth is often hidden in plain sight. Comment below and tell us about a time you misjudged someone, or were misjudged yourself. Let's remember to look deeper, to listen more carefully, and to treat every person we meet with the respect and dignity they deserve. Because we never truly know who we are talking to, and whose world we might be standing in.